The novel coronavirus pandemic has become a global tragedy unlike any other in our lifetimes. But this is neither our first nor our most deadly war with an infectious disease. Since humanity's earliest days, there has been a specter of illness and disease. As human civilization spread, enlarging into larger cities and with new trade routes developed and more mingling between different groups of people and animals, so did the likelihood of widespread disease outbreaks. Can you imagine that at the dawn of the 19th century, global life expectancy was just 29 years? Not because human beings could not live longer, but because so many of us died in infancy from disease or from infection or after getting wounded. Centuries before novel coronavirus struck, plague, smallpox and other contagions killed millions around the globe. They too were pandemics, which are nothing but epidemics that cover over a wide geographical area, crossing international boundaries and usually affecting a large number of people. 165 to 180 AD, Antonine Plague, deaths 5 million, cause unknown. Many historians trace the fall of the Roman Empire back to the Antonine Plague. The plague had swept Rome during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Nobody knows the exact cause, but symptoms recorded by Galen, a Greek physician, were gruesome skin sores, high fever, diarrhea, and sore throat. All these symptoms strongly suggest it was an outbreak of smallpox. There were two phases and not one of the outbreak. The first phase of the outbreak lasted until 180 CE. It affected the whole of the Roman Empire. The second outbreak happened in 251 to 266 CE. It compounded the effects of the earlier outbreak. So how did it reach Rome? The epidemic most likely emerged in China. From there, it spread westward along the Silk Road and by trading ships, and that's how it reached Rome. At the height of the epidemic, 2,000 people died daily. In the second outbreak, this number was more than 5,000. What is undisputed is that Lucius Verus, co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius, died from the illness in 169 CE. And Marcus died 11 years later from the same disease. The pandemic killed more than 5 million people across Italy, Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor.
There have been speculations whether Antonine Plague was smallpox or was it measles, and there is no concrete evidence to really point out what it was in terms of both these diseases. Because if you look at the description, it talks about having a pharyngitis or a sore throat, a pustular illness, and which are very similar between smallpox and measles until you clinically differentiate between the two. But one thing that the number of deaths that were caused due to Antonine Plague and that have been reported in Nature, like 5 million deaths, that is a pointer that it was mainly smallpox.
541 to 542 AD, Plague of Justinian, deaths 30 to 50 million, source rats and fleas. The plague of Justinian afflicted the entire Mediterranean basin, Europe and the Near East. It severely affected the Sasanian Empire and the Roman Empire, and especially its capital, Constantinople. Constantinople is the ancient name of modern-day Istanbul. The plague is named after the Roman Emperor Justinian I, during whose reign in Constantinople the outbreak occurred. The emperor himself is said to have contracted the disease and recovered at the height of the epidemic.
The plague of Justinian is characterized by this infection that was probably transmitted to Constantinople from Egypt, although we're not really sure. It probably originated somewhere in Asia. And what made the plague of Justinian unique was that the Roman Empire at the time was very vulnerable. It was weakened by years of conflict with other groups, the Goths, the Huns, the Persians. And one theme of pandemics is that they're often triggered by or at least accelerated by times of social and geopolitical disruption.
The outbreak continued to sweep across the Mediterranean world for another 225 years. It finally disappeared in 750 CE. It is thought to be the world's first episode of bubonic plague. It is believed that it arrived through infected fleas hitching rides across the world on the back of rodents on grain ships arriving from Egypt.
Plague of Justinian was caused by Yersinia pestis, which is a bacterium that lives in the digestive tract of fleas. These fleas live on black rats and other rodents, and they're very easily transmitted from place to place on ships. Fleas bite people, and then they spread the infection to humans. And then once the infection is established in humans, particularly the lung, people can spread the infection to each other in the small droplets in their breath.
The plague killed up to 5,000 people every day in Constantinople. It killed between 30 and 50 million people, about half of the world's population at that time. As it spread across Asia, North Africa, Arabia, and Europe.
When you have large groups of people together, large groups of people moving around, there's more opportunity to spread and transmit infection. So the plague of Justinian spread throughout Constantinople very quickly in the setting of this environment of the disruption through trade and conflict with these neighboring peoples. And then from there, it spread throughout the Roman Empire. It reached the capital of Rome in a year, and then throughout Germany, France, the United Kingdom, it was a significant event, and the first major outbreak or first major pandemic of what we call the bubonic plague. In recorded history.
After its last recurrence, pandemics on the scale of the plague of Justinian did not appear again in Europe until the Black Death of the 14th century. 1347 to 1352, Black Death, deaths 75 to 200 million, source rats and fleas. The Black Death was a devastating global epidemic of bubonic plague. It struck Europe and Asia in the mid-1300s. This too, like the plague of Justinian, spread to humans by rodents whose fleas carried the bacteria. The plague arrived in Europe with the arrival of 12 ships from the Black Sea. The ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. People who gathered on the docks learned that most sailors aboard the ships were dead, but those still alive were seriously ill and covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Sicilian authorities hastily ordered the ships out of the harbour, but it was too late. Over the next 5 years, the Black Death killed almost 1/3 of the continent's population. It is thought to have originated in Asia over 2,000 years ago and was most likely spread by trading ships.
Black Death is actually also bubonic plague, the same infection that caused the plague of Justinian. And the Black Death is probably the most famous of the pandemics caused by bubonic plague. It occurred in the 14th century and killed up to 1 in 3 people living in mainland Europe, Asia, and Africa. It was described by some as kind of a golden age of bacteria. The plague eventually went away, came back again in the 19th century in the form of the third pandemic, but we continue to have episodic cases, largely because this bacteria continues to live in rodent species around the world. But what made this case in 2009 most interesting was that it was actually acquired by a researcher who was conducting research on this particular infection. He got very sick and eventually passed away. And on autopsy, they realized that he had a condition called hereditary hemochromatosis, which leads to an abnormal iron buildup in the body. And that probably weakened his ability to fight infection. And it may also have fueled the growth of the Yersinia bacteria.
Third to 19th century, smallpox cause variola virus. Smallpox is thought to date back to the Egyptian Empire around the 3rd century BCE. Mummies with smallpox-like rashes dating back to that period are cited as evidence of the presence of smallpox millennia ago. It spread as civilizations grew, explorations happened, and trade routes expanded over the centuries. 3 out of every 10 people who got it died. Do you know that it was smallpox that became the basis for vaccination? During the smallpox epidemic across North America from 1775 to 1782, Revolutionary War soldiers took an unusual approach to protecting themselves from the virus known as variola major. In a process known as variolation, they took virus-loaded material from an infected person's smallpox pustule, carved an incision into the flesh of a healthy soldier, and rubbed it in. Recipients of variolation invariably got the disease and were quarantined. About 5% died, but most got a mild version of the smallpox disease. Years later, in 1796, Edward Jenner, who himself had been variolated as a child, would try a similar method, taking Lycian material from a woman who had cowpox and rubbing it into the wound of an 8-year-old boy. When he later tried to infect the boy with smallpox, no disease developed. The concept of vaccination, named after the Latin word for cow, vacca, was born.
Variolation was a practice that long preceded Edward Jenner. Basically, what they realized at the time is that if you take pus and infected material from the blister on a smallpox patient's skin and introduce that pus into another patient, that other patient might develop a weaker version of the infection and eventually develop immunity. However, that was risky because people could also acquire the infection through that route. Where Jenner had his breakthrough was that it had long been realized that milkmaids were genuinely immune to smallpox. And Jenner basically hypothesized that the pus in the blisters that milkmaids got from cowpox infection could actually protect them from smallpox. So what he did was he took an 8-year-old boy and exposed that 8-year-old boy to cowpox pus and from the blister of a milkmaid. And he later went back some days later and exposed that boy to smallpox, which would actually be reprehensible ethically in the modern era. And he found that the boy was protected. And from that practice, we learned to immunize, and the process of modern vaccination was born.
1665 to 1666. Great Plague of London, deaths 1 lakh, cause Yersinia pestis bacterium. It was the last major epidemic of the bubonic plague to occur in England. It killed around 1 lakh people, that's almost a quarter of London's population, in just 18 months. And it spread beyond London. Again, blame the rats with pesky fleas on their backs. The bacteria that caused it was Yersinia pestis, which is usually transmitted through the bite of an infected rat flea. By September 1665, it had peaked. There were 7,000 deaths in a week. In London, in a matter of 7 months, around a quarter of the population died.
The Great Plague of London was actually part of the second pandemic of Yersinia, the first being the plague of Justinian that we already discussed. The second pandemic began in the 14th century with the Black Death, and there were episodes where there'd be more infections and then less infections, and then eventually the Great Plague of London took place in the 1660s. It killed perhaps 100,000 people, which was far less than the Black Death. And factors such as poor city sanitation, crowding, and areas of the city that were very economically disadvantaged were felt to fuel the epidemic with respect to the Great Plague, or the Great Plague of London. But what's interesting is that those types of factors that we saw with the Great Plague of London continue to fuel other forms of pandemic. For example, the current COVID-19 pandemic, you see those same socioeconomic factors in play in terms of where in various cities you see the majority of infections and how those infections move throughout the population.
Polio, 1789, cause poliovirus. From an Egyptian stone carving dated 1403 to 1365 BC, it is apparent that polio was around even then. The carving shows a priest with a walking stick and a foot with deformities. But the disease was given its first clinical description in 1789 by British physician Michael Underwood. It was recognized as a condition only in 1840.
Poliomyelitis, which we shorten to polio, has actually been around for millennia. It was depicted in ancient Egyptian artwork. However, it began to appear more dramatically in the late 1800s, which culminated in these large pandemics in the early to mid 20th century. Interestingly, the theory for why that appeared and why it became an issue so suddenly is fascinating. So we think that actually improved sanitation weakened the population's immunity to polio. And it generally affected younger people who didn't yet have the opportunity to develop immunity from prior exposures. And the virus was transmitted from person to person via what we call in medicine the fecal-oral route, which is contamination of stool material on hands that is spread to the mouth and eventually to the digestive tract.
One of the first few documented outbreaks of polio is from the Americas, from a place called Vermont, way back in 1874. And then one of the largest outbreaks was recorded in 1916. Even the US President Franklin Roosevelt was affected by polio, and he had paralysis of the limbs also and wasting of limbs.
In India, vaccination against polio started in 1978 with expanded program on immunization. By 1999, it covered around 60% of infants. In 1985, the Universal Immunization Program was launched to cover all the districts of the country. In 1995, following the Global Polio Eradication Initiative of the World Health Organization, India launched Pulse Polio Immunization Program with Universal Immunization Program, which aimed at 100% coverage. On 27th March 2014, the World Health Organization declared India a polio-free country, since no cases of wild polio were reported for 5 years.
India documented its last case of polio in 2011 in West Bengal. After that, no case of poliovirus has been reported from our country, and subsequently in 2014, polio was declared as eliminated. And after that also, India has really struggled hard to maintain its polio-free status, and multiple initiatives have been taken to maintain or uphold the polio-free status of the country.
1817 to 1975, the cholera pandemics. Deaths 1 million, cause V. cholerae bacteria. Few societies have been spared by this highly infectious bacteria. It is transmitted via feces-contaminated water and causes severe diarrhea and vomiting. 7 cholera pandemics occurred over a period of more than 150 years.
Cholera is generally a disease of the poor, and areas where cholera occur, especially rural and tribal areas, cholera can cause a great devastation. So combating cholera was an art by itself. One had to go prepared with barely nothing, but use ingenious methods to identify it. I remember in an outbreak of cholera somewhere in an extremely poor rural area, there were no incubators to isolate the organism. So what we did was we used these lanterns, which we carry in case of a place not having power. And the heat of the lanterns was enough to grow the organism in our bacteriological media. So these are small innovations at the field itself. And for cholera, we had to use a variety of techniques to isolate the organism to prove that the outbreak is due to cholera.
The first cholera pandemic began in 1817 near Calcutta in India's Bengal region. The disease then spread to Southeast Asia, Middle East, Europe and Eastern Africa through trade routes. The second pandemic lasted from 1826 to 1837 and particularly affected North America and Europe due to advancements in transportation, global trade and increased migration, including of soldiers. The third pandemic erupted in 1846 and extended to North Africa and South America. The fourth pandemic broke out in 1863 and spread from India to Naples and Spain. The fifth pandemic started in India in 1881 and spread to Europe, Asia and South America. The sixth pandemic started in India and was from 1899 to 1923. The seventh cholera pandemic began in Indonesia in 1961, reached East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, India and Soviet Union. There have been several outbreaks since.
Our discovery of Vibrio cholerae 0139, which was a new cholera bug that was previously never identified. And this we did at the National Institute of Cholera and Enteric Disease in Calcutta and at the ICDTRB in Bangladesh. It's basically, we received strains somewhere around November 1992. And there were a cluster of strains coming from different parts of the country. We were a bit surprised because this was unusual that these many strains were coming. And we found that these strains were not O1, I mean not the traditional bug which causes cholera, but was another type. And this led us to do some basic fundamental studies using different anti-sera. Anti-sera is an identifying agent for these organisms, and we did these initial tests and found that these strains did not react as traditional ones, and it turned out to be that a new organism which we discovered with the help of our Japanese collaborators. We called this organism Vibrio cholerae 0139, 0139 being the number which designated the new type.
1648, yellow fever. Deaths 1,50,000, source mosquitoes. Yellow fever is an acute viral disease transmitted by infected mosquitoes. The yellow in the name refers to jaundice that affects some patients, as it often turns the skin of sufferers a distinct shade of yellow. The virus is endemic in tropical areas of Africa and Central and South America. The first epidemic of yellow fever was reported in 1648 in the Yucatan. Over the ensuing 200 years, outbreaks occurred widely in tropical America, the North American coastal cities, and Europe.
In previous years, when the air travel was very less, then the mode of transmission of diseases or spread of diseases was mainly through sea route. So, US indulged in lot of slave trade from Africa, and during this slave trade, when the slaves were carried from Africa to US, they were mainly carried in ships, and in these ships they are believed to be lot of water stored in cans or containers, which was generally uncovered. And when these slaves were brought in, subsequently along with them, lot of mosquitoes also came in, and they got a very nice ground to breed because of lot of water being stored during the sea travel. So while this happened and the slaves were transported, the mosquitoes also came along, and these mosquitoes carried the yellow fever virus, and that's how the outbreaks of yellow fever, which started way back in 60s and continued till 90s, have been reported from the Americas.
The COVID-19 pandemic has inspired lots of comparisons to the 1918 flu, sometimes called the Spanish flu. The name and comparisons lead us to ask many questions. Did the Spanish flu originate in Spain? How did the Spanish flu spread so quickly across the world? Are there any similarities between the Spanish flu and COVID-19? Was social distancing encouraged during the Spanish flu outbreak too? Which pandemics followed the Spanish flu? Throughout history, have viruses, bacteria and parasites been the biggest killers? Why did WHO say that COVID-19 is 10 times deadlier than the swine flu? Why is there still no vaccine for HIV? Have the number of outbreaks increased manifold over the past century? And did the experience of some countries in combating past epidemics help them combat COVID-19 more effectively? BioQuest will return with answers.